At 04:30 hours on September 14, 1944, Brigadier General James Gavin stood in a muddy command post 3 miles from the German border, staring at aerial reconnaissance photos of the Siegfried Line, Hitler's West Wall, a defensive system the Germans had spent 6 years building and believed was impenetrable. The photos showed what every military engineer expected: concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, dragon's teeth tank obstacles extending for miles, minefields marked by disturbed earth, machine gun positions covering every approach, and artillery pre-registered on every logical attack route. The Siegfried Line was designed to stop exactly what the Allies were attempting: a direct assault by mechanized forces across open terrain. Every tactical doctrine, every military textbook, and every experienced officer said the same thing. You don't attack fortified defensive lines head-on. You find flanks. You use artillery to suppress defenses. You conduct deliberate breaching operations with engineer support. You accept that reduction of such fortifications takes weeks of careful preparation and methodical assault. The German generals commanding the Siegfried Line defenses had read the same textbooks. They knew the Allies would follow doctrine. They were prepared for doctrine. Gavin was planning to do something different, something that would later be described by German commanders as foolish, by American historians as reckless, and by the soldiers who executed it as the craziest goddamn thing we ever did. He was going to attack the Siegfried Line at night without preparatory artillery bombardment, using paratroopers who'd been trained for airborne assault, but were currently fighting as conventional infantry. He was going to send them through the minefields and dragon's teeth in darkness, navigate by compass and dead reckoning to avoid German artillery targeting, and assault the concrete bunkers from angles the defenders hadn't fortified, because no sane commander would attack from those directions. The plan violated every principle of offensive operations. It sacrificed artillery support, the fundamental advantage Allied forces possessed in every engagement. It relied on nighttime navigation through obstacle belts that were supposed to be impassable without engineer clearance. It required soldiers to move silently through terrain the Germans had designed to channel attackers into kill zones. And most critically, it assumed that doing something obviously stupid would work precisely because it was obviously stupid. The German defenders prepared for rational tactics would be unprepared for irrational ones. Gavin's staff had spent 3 days trying to talk him out of it. His operations officer called it suicide. His intelligence officer said the casualty estimates made the plan unacceptable. His artillery commander pointed out that attacking without preparatory fires meant the infantry would face defensive fires without suppression. Even his regimental commanders, officers who jumped into Normandy and survived Market Garden, thought the plan was insane. But Gavin had done something none of them had done. He'd walked the ground at night, personally reconnoitered the German positions in darkness, and discovered something the aerial photos didn't show. The Siegfried Line's defenses were optimized for daylight engagement against mechanized forces following predictable attack routes. At night, from unexpected directions, using infantry tactics instead of armor tactics, the impregnable fortress had gaps. Not physical gaps. The obstacles and bunkers were exactly where the photos showed them. But tactical gaps in fields of fire, dead zones in defensive coverage, and most importantly, psychological gaps in what the defenders expected. The German commanders defending this sector, General Major Rudolf Freiherr von Roman and Oberst Heinrich Auer, had prepared for the attack they knew was coming. They'd reinforced the obvious approach routes. They'd positioned their best troops at the strongest points. They'd coordinated artillery fires to cover the terrain where Allied tanks would have to advance. They'd done everything right according to military science and defensive doctrine. They were ready for a professional, methodical, doctrinal assault. They weren't ready for 200 American paratroopers to walk through their minefields in darkness, navigate around their dragon's teeth by feel, and assault their concrete bunkers from behind, using tactics designed for seizing airfields, not reducing fortifications. The attack that began at 04:30 on September 14, 1944, would break through the Siegfried Line's main defensive belt in 48 hours. A fortification system that German propaganda had claimed would stop the Allies for months, and that Allied planners had estimated would require 3 weeks of careful reduction. The breakthrough came not from superior firepower, not from overwhelming numbers, not from brilliant tactical innovation in the traditional sense. It came from a willingness to do something so contrary to military logic that the enemy couldn't comprehend it was happening until it had already succeeded. German after-action reports from this engagement repeatedly use the word unerklärlich, inexplicable. They couldn't understand how American forces had penetrated defenses that should have been impenetrable. They kept reporting that the Americans must have had intelligence about weak points, must have found gaps that German engineers had missed, must have used some technical capability German intelligence hadn't identified. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. The Americans had attacked stupidly, and the stupid had worked because the Germans had prepared for smart. Von Roman would later write in his memoirs that the American assault violated every principle of military science and succeeded precisely because it was professionally indefensible. Auer's combat report stated, bluntly, "The enemy attacked in a manner no competent commander would authorize. Our defenses were positioned to defeat competent attacks." The 82nd Airborne Division lost 486 men in the 48-hour assault, killed, wounded, or missing. By conventional military calculation, that was an acceptable casualty rate for breaching the Siegfried Line, which had been expected to cost thousands of casualties over weeks of fighting. By Gavin's calculation, it was 486 men who would have died anyway in a conventional assault, but who accomplished in 2 days what doctrine said would take 3 weeks. This is the story of how one foolish American tactic, attacking the strongest German defensive line in the West using methods that military professionals considered suicidal, broke through in 48 hours and opened the route to Germany, not because American forces were stronger or better equipped, but because sometimes the most effective tactic is the one the enemy has dismissed as impossible because no rational commander would attempt it. James Gavin grew up in Brooklyn, the adopted son of working-class parents who'd taken in an infant from a Catholic orphanage in 1907. He learned early that being underestimated was an advantage. People made assumptions about orphans, about immigrants' children, about kids from rough neighborhoods. Those assumptions created opportunities for anyone smart enough to recognize that expectations were constraints on other people's thinking, not limits on what was actually possible. He joined the Army in 1924 at age 17, lying about his age because he wanted out of Brooklyn and the military was hiring. The Army of the 1920s was small, professional, and intellectually stagnant, still fighting the last war in its doctrine, still convinced that trenches and artillery dominated warfare, still commanded by officers who'd learned tactics from men who fought in the Civil War. Gavin absorbed the doctrine, passed the tests, earned his promotion to corporal, and privately thought most of what he was learning was obsolete. He earned an appointment to West Point in 1925 through competitive examination, one of the few paths available to enlisted men without political connections. West Point in the late 1920s taught Napoleonic warfare adapted for 20th century weapons, massed formations, artillery preparation, methodical advance, consolidation of gains. The curriculum was rigorous, historically grounded, and almost entirely focused on European warfare between professional armies on open terrain. Gavin graduated in 1929, ranking 185th out of 299 cadets, respectable but unremarkable, noted for adequate tactical understanding and satisfactory adherence to doctrine. What his instructors didn't note, what academy evaluations couldn't measure, was that Gavin spent his free time reading accounts of irregular warfare, guerrilla campaigns, and military disasters where conventional forces following sound doctrine had been defeated by opponents using unsound tactics. He was particularly interested in failures, battles where everything was done correctly according to military science, and the result was catastrophic defeat. The pattern, he noticed, was that military doctrine optimized for expected threats, which meant doctrine created vulnerabilities to unexpected approaches. He became fascinated with airborne operations in the late 1930s, when the concept was still experimental, and most Army officers considered it a wasteful novelty. The idea of dropping soldiers behind enemy lines without heavy weapons, without artillery support, without secure supply lines, it violated every principle of conventional warfare, which was exactly why Gavin thought it might work. Not because airborne assault was tactically superior to conventional operations, but because enemies prepared for conventional operations would be unprepared for airborne assault. He volunteered for the newly formed Parachute Infantry in 1941, took command of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment in 1942, and jumped into Sicily in July 1943 with the first large-scale American airborne operation of the war. The Sicily jump was a disaster by conventional measures, planes scattered by weather and anti-aircraft fire, paratroopers landing miles from drop zones, units fragmented across the countryside, command and control impossible. By traditional military assessment, the operation should have failed completely. But Gavin noticed something. The scattered paratroopers caused chaos in German rear areas, far exceeding their actual combat power. German commanders couldn't determine where the main attack was coming from because paratroopers were everywhere. Communication lines were cut, supply routes were interdicted, and most critically, German forces were diverted from defending the beaches to hunting scattered airborne units inland. The airborne drop succeeded strategically despite failing tactically, precisely because its tactical failure created operational effects the Germans couldn't counter with doctrinal responses. He jumped into Normandy on June 6, 1944, as Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne. The Normandy drop was better executed than Sicily, but still chaotic. Units scattered, objectives seized by ad hoc groups assembled from mixed units, success achieved through improvisation rather than execution of detailed plans. Again, Gavin noticed that chaos worked in American favor. German defenders prepared for amphibious assault from the sea were disrupted by airborne forces appearing from unexpected directions, using terrain the Germans had dismissed as impassable, attacking objectives the Germans had fortified against seaborne assault, but not against attack from inland. Market Garden in September 1944 taught him a different lesson. The operation to seize bridges in Holland was meticulously planned, professionally executed, and failed catastrophically because German forces adapted faster than Allied planners had anticipated. The Allies followed their plan. The Germans countered the plan. Doctrine met counter-doctrine, and the better prepared force won. Gavin concluded that detailed planning created predictability, and predictability gave enemies time to prepare effective counters. By September 1944, Gavin commanded the 82nd Airborne Division, 13,000 soldiers trained for airborne assault, but currently fighting as conventional infantry because the front had moved beyond the range where airborne operations were practical. They were approaching the German border and the Siegfried Line, a defensive system that represented everything conventional military engineering could achieve: depth, redundancy, interlocking fields of fire, obstacles designed to channel attackers into kill zones, and sufficient concrete and steel to withstand any artillery barrage the Allies could sustain. Allied intelligence had studied the Siegfried Line extensively. The assessment was sobering. Attacking the line head-on would require overwhelming artillery support, methodical breaching by engineer units, acceptance of high casualties, and realistic timelines measured in weeks rather than days. The British were advocating for outflanking the line entirely, swinging north through Holland, avoiding the fortifications, approaching Germany from directions where the Siegfried Line didn't extend. American commanders were planning deliberate reduction operations, artillery preparation, infantry assault, consolidation, repeat. Gavin thought both approaches were wrong. Not tactically wrong. The doctrine was sound, the planning was competent, the execution would probably succeed eventually. But strategically wrong because they gave the Germans time to reinforce, time to bring up reserves, time to adapt. The Siegfried Line's real strength wasn't its concrete and steel. It was the time it bought for German forces to reorganize after the chaos of France and Belgium. He started thinking about the problem differently. Not, how do we reduce these fortifications according to doctrine, but how do we attack these fortifications in ways doctrine says we shouldn't? The Siegfried Line was designed to defeat conventional attacks. What if you attacked unconventionally? What if you sacrificed the advantages doctrine said you needed and exploited vulnerabilities doctrine said didn't exist? He spent 3 days personally reconnoitering the German positions, something brigadier generals weren't supposed to do because the risk of capture or death was considered unacceptable for senior officers. He went at night with a small patrol, wearing lieutenant's insignia because German snipers targeted officers. He walked the ground where his soldiers would attack, looked at the fortifications from angles the Germans thought nobody would attack from, and tested movement through obstacles the Germans believed would stop infantry. What he discovered changed his understanding of the Siegfried Line's vulnerabilities. The fortifications were optimized for defeating mechanized attacks during daylight. Machine gun positions covered fields of fire where tanks would advance. Artillery was pre-registered on roads and open ground where vehicles had to travel. The Dragon's Teeth, rows of concrete pyramids designed to stop tanks, were positioned to channel armor into kill zones covered by anti-tank guns. But at night, from unexpected directions, using infantry instead of armor, the fortress had gaps. Not physical gaps. The obstacles were continuous and the bunkers were everywhere, but tactical gaps in what the defenses could actually engage. Machine gun fields of fire that were devastating in daylight became less effective at night when you couldn't see targets until they were close. Artillery registered on roads and open ground became irrelevant if attackers avoided roads and moved through rough terrain. Dragon's Teeth that stopped tanks were obstacles infantry could navigate around in darkness. Most importantly, Gavin recognized a psychological gap. German defenders were prepared for attacks they understood, combined arms assaults with armor, artillery, and infantry coordinating according to doctrine. They weren't prepared for attacks that made no doctrinal sense. Infantry attacking without artillery support, soldiers moving through obstacles without engineer clearance, assaults from directions where the approaches were so difficult that no competent commander would use them. Gavin decided to attack stupidly, not carelessly. Every detail would be planned, but counter-doctrinally. He would sacrifice artillery support to achieve surprise. He would navigate through obstacles instead of breaching them. He would attack from directions the Germans had dismissed as impossible. He would do everything military science said not to do, because the Germans were prepared for military science. His staff resisted. The operations officer, Colonel Reuben Tucker, argued that attacking without artillery support was suicidal. The intelligence officer presented casualty estimates showing the plan would cost 800 to 1,200 men, unacceptable for a breakthrough that conventional methods might achieve with similar losses over a longer period. The artillery commander pointed out that giving up preparatory fires meant giving up the fundamental advantage Allied forces possessed over German defenders. Gavin listened to every objection, acknowledged the risks, and explained his reasoning. The Germans have spent 6 years preparing to defeat attacks they understand. We're going to attack in ways they won't understand until it's too late to matter. Yes, we'll take casualties, but we'll take them in 48 hours instead of 3 weeks, and we'll break through because they're not ready for stupid. He presented the plan to his regimental commanders on September 12th. The attack would begin before dawn on September 14th. No artillery preparation. Movement in darkness through terrain German intelligence had assessed as too difficult for night operations. Assault on bunkers from angles not covered by primary defensive fires. The objective: penetrate the main defensive belt in 48 hours and establish a breach that follow-on forces could exploit. The commander's initial reaction was uniform skepticism. Then Colonel Tucker asked the question that captured everyone's concern. "Sir, what happens if this doesn't work?" Gavin's answer was blunt. "If it doesn't work, we've lost 486 men to 200 men, depending on how badly it fails. If conventional assault doesn't work, we lose more men over 3 weeks and probably fail anyway, because the Germans have time to reinforce. I'd rather try stupid and fail in 2 days than try doctrine and fail in 3 weeks. The assault began at 4:30 hours on September 14th, 1944, in complete darkness and total silence. No artillery preparation, no aerial bombardment, no signal flares announcing the attack. Just 3,800 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne's 504th and 505th Parachute Infantry Regiments moving through the pre-dawn darkness toward fortifications the Germans believed were impregnable. The first challenge was the minefields. Standard doctrine called for engineer teams to clear lanes using mine detectors and Bangalore torpedoes, a process that was methodical, time-consuming, and noisy, exactly what Gavin's plan couldn't afford. Instead, lead squads advanced using a technique borrowed from German stormtrooper tactics in World War I, probing the ground ahead with bayonets, feeling for the pressure plates of anti-personnel mines, marking safe paths with tape barely visible in darkness. It was dangerous, slow, and required nerves most men didn't possess. But it was silent, private first class. Robert Patterson led one of those squads through a minefield east of the town of Ubach. He'd been a scout in Normandy, had survived 3 months of combat, and had developed an instinct for ground that wanted to kill you versus ground that was merely dangerous. He moved in total darkness, feeling with his bayonet, testing each step, aware that a single mistake would detonate a mine that would alert every German position within 500 yards. Behind him, 14 men followed single file through the path he was clearing, each one placing their feet exactly where Patterson had stepped. It took 43 minutes to cross 200 yards of mined ground. Patterson marked the safe route with engineer tape, returned to guide the next squad through, and repeated the process 3 times before dawn. By 06:15 hours, 2 companies had infiltrated through the minefield without triggering a single mine. The German defenders had no idea American forces were already inside their outer obstacle belt. The Dragon's Teeth presented a different problem. These concrete pyramids, 4 feet high, arranged in multiple rows, were designed to stop tanks by breaking tracks or bellying out vehicles that tried to cross them. For infantry, they were obstacles, but not barriers. Soldiers could climb over them, move between them, use them for cover. The key was recognizing that obstacles designed to stop vehicles didn't necessarily stop men, especially men trained to fight in urban terrain where every building was an obstacle to bypass or exploit. Sergeant Michael Holinsky's platoon reached the Dragon's Teeth at 05:45 hours, just as dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Standard doctrine called for engineers to blow gaps using demolitions. Holinsky didn't have engineers, didn't have demolitions, and didn't have time. He had 30 men with rifles, grenades, and the realization that the Dragon's Teeth were 4 feet high, spaced 4 feet apart, and arranged in straight rows that created corridors, running perpendicular to the German defensive positions. He led his platoon through the corridors between the teeth, using the concrete pyramids as cover from German machine gun positions that were oriented to fire across the teeth at vehicles trying to breach them. The German gunners were positioned to engage targets in front of the Dragon's Teeth, not targets moving through the corridors between them. Holinsky's platoon reached the far side of the obstacle belt and took positions 50 yards from the nearest German bunker before the defenders realized American infantry had penetrated the barriers without creating any of the noise. Explosions, vehicle engines shouted commands that normally accompanied breaching operations. The bunker assaults required a different adaptation. Concrete bunkers with reinforced firing ports were designed to withstand direct hits from tank guns and artillery shells. Attacking them frontally was suicide. The machine guns covering the approaches would cut down infantry long before they reached throwing distance for grenades or satchel charges. Standard doctrine called for combined arms, tanks to suppress the bunkers with direct fire, while infantry maneuvered to assault positions, engineers to place demolitions, artillery to isolate the bunkers from supporting fires. Gavin's plan used none of that. Instead, he'd studied the bunker designs from captured German engineering documents and noticed something. The bunkers were mutually supporting when attacked from predictable directions, but they had blind spots to the flanks and rear. The Germans had positioned them assuming attacks would come from the west along logical approach routes. They hadn't heavily fortified the sides and backs because attacking from those directions required infiltrating through obstacles and minefields that conventional operations couldn't penetrate without detection. Lieutenant James McGillis led the assault on Bunker 247, a fortified position with 3 machine gun ports covering the main approach from the west. McGillis had reached a position 100 yards southeast of the bunker by moving through the Dragon's Teeth corridors while it was still dark. At 06:23 hours, with dawn providing enough light to see but not enough for German gunners to acquire targets effectively, he led his platoon in a flanking assault from the south, a direction the bunker's primary weapons couldn't cover without the defenders repositioning guns that were fixed in place by their mounting brackets. The assault took 6 minutes. McGillis's platoon closed to within 20 yards, using dead ground the bunker couldn't observe. Bangalore torpedoes were placed against the rear entrance, not the reinforced steel door facing the expected attack direction, but the lighter access door on the side that supply personnel used. The explosion blew the door. Fragmentation grenades went through the opening, and the bunker was neutralized before the defenders could reorient their machine guns to engage threats from unexpected directions. The pattern repeated across the 82nd Airborne's assault zone. Bunkers designed to defeat frontal attacks were assaulted from flanks and rear. Machine gun positions oriented to cover logical approach routes were bypassed by infiltrators moving through terrain the Germans had dismissed as too difficult for night movement. Artillery that had been pre-registered on roads and open ground fired on coordinates where American forces weren't because the Americans were navigating cross-country using compass bearings and terrain features. By 0800 hours, 3 hours and 30 minutes after the assault began, the 82nd Airborne had penetrated the Siegfried Line's outer defensive belt along a 2-mile front. German commanders were still trying to understand what was happening. The first contact reports were confused. American infantry had appeared inside the defensive perimeter without triggering the warning systems, minefields, observation posts, listening posts that were supposed to provide early warning. Units were calling for artillery support on targets that had already moved past the pre-registered fire points. General Major von Roman, commanding the 246th Volksgrenadier Division defending this sector, received reports at 0745 that seemed impossible. American forces had penetrated through minefields without clearance operations. They'd bypassed Dragon's Teeth without blowing gaps. They'd assaulted bunkers from directions where the approaches were too difficult for coordinated attacks. His operations officer suggested the Americans must have had detailed intelligence about gaps in the defenses. Von Roman disagreed. There were no gaps. The Americans were somehow attacking through defenses that should have stopped them. At 0830, von Roman committed his reserve battalion to counterattack and seal the breach. This was doctrinal response to enemy penetration, immediate counterattack to restore the defensive line before the enemy could exploit the breakthrough. The counterattack moved down the main road from the reserve position toward the breach, exactly as doctrine specified, exactly as tactical plans had rehearsed. Gavin had anticipated this. He'd positioned his only artillery support, 2 battalions of 105mm howitzers, to fire on a single target, the road the German reserves would use for their counterattack. At 0847, as von Roman's reserve battalion moved south, American artillery opened fire. Not on the Siegfried Line bunkers, those were already neutralized. On the counterattack that conventional doctrine required, moving along the route that conventional tactics specified. The German reserve battalion took 40% casualties in 15 minutes. The counterattack stalled. Von Roman's fallback defensive line, the position he'd planned to hold if the main line was breached, was now exposed because his reserves that were supposed to defend it were shattered on the approach road. At a 09:05, he reported to Corps headquarters that American forces had achieved breakthrough and requested immediate reinforcement. The request was denied. Corps had no reinforcements available. Von Roman was ordered to hold with forces on hand. By 1200 hours on September 14th, the 82nd Airborne controlled a breach in the Siegfried Line, 2 miles wide and 1 mile deep. Follow-on forces, the 8th Infantry Division, were moving through the gap, exploiting into the German rear areas where the defenses were oriented to stop attacks from the west, not from behind. The fortress that was supposed to delay the Allies for weeks had been penetrated in 8 hours by an attack that violated every principle of sound tactics. But the breakthrough wasn't complete. The Siegfried Line had depth, multiple defensive belts, fallback positions, reserves positioned to seal penetrations. Von Roman was reorganizing his shattered forces, bringing up what reserves he had, preparing to counterattack again once he understood what the Americans had actually done. Oberst Auer, commanding the 404th Regiment in the 2nd Defensive Belt, was positioning his forces to contain the breach. The next 40 hours would determine whether Gavin's foolish attack had achieved strategic breakthrough or merely tactical penetration that German reserves would seal off. The German response during the next 40 hours demonstrated exactly what Gavin had calculated. Defenders prepared for conventional attacks couldn't adapt quickly enough to counter unconventional methods. Von Roman and Auer were competent, experienced commanders who understood defensive warfare. They'd positioned their forces correctly according to doctrine. They'd prepared fallback positions, established fire coordination, and maintained reserves for counterattacks. Everything they did was professionally sound. And none of it worked because they were fighting the battle they'd expected rather than the battle that was actually happening. At 14:30 hours on September 14th, Auer launched a counterattack against what he believed was the main American penetration. His intelligence assessment, based on standard tactical logic, identified the breach point as the sector where American forces would have the easiest advance route toward German rear areas. He positioned his regiment to hit that sector with maximum force, intending to cut off the American spearhead and trap forward units inside the defensive belt. But Gavin hadn't concentrated his forces where the advance was easiest. He'd dispersed them across the entire 2-mile breach, moving multiple small columns through rough terrain the Germans considered unsuitable for mechanized operations. When Auer's counterattack hit what he thought was the American main effort, he found a screening force of 200 men who delayed him for 3 hours, while the actual penetration occurred 2 miles north through terrain Auer had assessed as impassable for significant forces. This pattern repeated throughout September 14th and 15th. German commanders made tactically sound decisions based on conventional military logic. American forces did things that made no conventional sense, moving through difficult terrain instead of using roads, attacking dispersed instead of concentrated, infiltrating instead of assaulting. Each German response arrived at the right place to counter conventional operations and the wrong place to counter what the 82nd Airborne was actually doing. The fighting was brutal regardless of tactics. Private Robert Patterson, who'd led his squad through the minefield in darkness, was killed at 16:20 on September 14th by machine gun fire while clearing a German strongpoint. Lieutenant Magellas, who'd captured Bunker 247, was wounded by artillery fragments at Oro 340 on September 15th, but refused evacuation and continued commanding his platoon with a field dressing covering shrapnel wounds in his shoulder and neck. Sergeant Helinski's platoon, which had infiltrated through the Dragon's Teeth, suffered 40% casualties during 36 hours of continuous combat as they fought through the 2nd Defensive Belt. The casualty rate was high, 486 killed or wounded by the end of September 15th, but it was distributed across the entire breach rather than concentrated in frontal assaults on prepared defenses. Men died from machine gun fire, artillery, small arms, and the random violence of combat in fortified terrain. But they died while advancing, penetrating deeper, forcing German defenders to abandon positions that should have been defendable, creating chaos in rear areas that German command structure couldn't control. By Oro 800 on September 15th, the 82nd Airborne had penetrated both primary defensive belts and reached the 3rd Belt, the final major fortified zone, before the Siegfried Line gave way to less heavily defended depth positions. This 3rd Belt was supposed to be the line German forces would hold even if the outer belts were breached. It was reinforced with the best troops von Roman had available, positioned in bunkers that had clear fields of fire across relatively open terrain, supported by artillery that could mass fires on any approach route. Gavin looked at the situation and made another counter-doctrinal decision. Instead of consolidating the breakthrough and bringing up artillery and armor to reduce the 3rd Belt systematically, He ordered an immediate assault using the same infiltration tactics that had worked for the first two belts. His staff argued for consolidation. The troops were exhausted, ammunition was low, casualties needed evacuation, and the forces available for continued attack were fragmented across 2 miles of captured territory. Gavin's response captured his entire tactical philosophy. The Germans are confused and off balance right now. If we stop to consolidate, they'll have time to figure out what we're doing and adapt. Confusion is a weapon. We keep hitting them before they can think. The assault on the Third Belt began at 1600 hours on September 15th, after 10 hours of preparation that consisted mainly of redistributing ammunition and reorganizing units that had been mixed together during the first 2 days of fighting. There was no artillery preparation. Gavin's artillery was still displacing forward through the captured ground. There was no tank support. The terrain was too broken and the roads were too cratered from German demolitions. It was just infantry, exhausted and depleted, attacking fortifications using the same methods that had worked before. The Third Belt broke faster than the first two. Not because the defenses were weaker, they weren't, but because the defenders were demoralized and confused. German soldiers in the bunkers had watched American forces infiltrate through defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable. They'd seen counterattacks fail. They had received contradictory orders from commanders who couldn't determine where the main American effort was concentrated. And they'd lost faith that the Siegfried Line would actually stop this assault. When paratroopers appeared in darkness behind bunkers that were oriented to fire west, when German defenders heard grenades detonating in positions they thought were secure, when machine gun positions that should have dominated the battlefield were overrun from flanks they hadn't fortified, the psychological effect was cumulative. Defenders began surrendering rather than fighting to the last man. Entire bunker complexes were abandoned as crews retreated to fallback positions that no longer existed because follow-on American forces had already occupied them. By 2200 hours on September 15th, 48 hours after the assault began, the 82nd Airborne controlled a breach in the Siegfried Line, 4 miles wide and 3 miles deep, penetrating all 3 primary defensive belts. Follow-on forces were exploiting through the gap. German defenses in the sector had collapsed not from overwhelming force, but from cumulative confusion and the psychological impact of defenses failing to defend. Von Roman's after-action report, filed 3 days later after he'd been relieved of command, was remarkably honest. The American assault succeeded because it violated fundamental tactical principles in ways our defensive preparations could not counter. We were positioned to defeat competent attacks conducted according to military doctrine. The enemy attacked incompetently and succeeded because our competent defenses could not adapt to their incompetent methods. Ours report was more bitter. The Americans fought like barbarians, no artillery preparation, no systematic breaching operations, no adherence to the tactical principles that separate professional military forces from armed mobs. They attacked from directions we did not defend because no sane commander attacks from such directions. They infiltrated through obstacles designed to be impassable. They assaulted our strongest positions while bypassing weaker ones. Nothing they did made military sense, and therefore our defensive plans, which were based on military sense, failed to stop them. The German High Command's assessment, circulated as a classified lessons learned document in October 1944, was more analytical, but reached the same conclusion. American airborne forces demonstrated tactical flexibility that exploited weaknesses in defensive systems optimized for conventional operations. Defensive planning must account for irrational attacks conducted by forces willing to accept high casualties in exchange for rapid penetration. The Siegfried Line's failure in this sector resulted from defensive assumptions that proved invalid when the attacker deliberately violated tactical doctrine. What none of the German reports acknowledged, what institutional military thinking couldn't easily admit, was that the Americans hadn't attacked irrationally. They'd attacked counter-rationally, which was different. Gavin had made calculated decisions to sacrifice conventional advantages in exchange for surprise, psychological impact, and speed. The tactics looked foolish to professionals prepared for professional warfare. But they were effective precisely because they looked foolish. The 82nd Airborne's breakthrough at the Siegfried Line created a gap that American armor exploited for 3 weeks, advancing into Germany proper and capturing territory the Germans had believed would take months for the Allies to reach. Other American divisions began studying the 82nd's tactics, adapting them for use against other fortified positions. The British, initially skeptical of what they considered cowboy tactics, reluctantly acknowledged that unorthodox methods had achieved results conventional operations might not have accomplished. By October 1944, attacking fortified positions at night without artillery preparation had become an accepted, though not preferred, tactical option in situations where surprise and speed mattered more than methodical reduction. The technique that had been considered foolish in September was being taught at infantry schools by November. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. By that time, the tactics Gavin had used to break the Siegfried Line had been studied, analyzed, and incorporated into Army doctrine with the careful qualifications institutional military thinking always applies to unconventional success. In specific circumstances, where surprise is achievable and enemy defensive preparations follow predictable patterns, commanders may consider night infiltration operations that sacrifice preparatory fires in exchange for tactical surprise. The doctrine acknowledged the tactic worked while emphasizing it shouldn't be routine. James Gavin emerged from the war as one of the Army's youngest and most decorated generals, 2 stars at age 37, credited with successful airborne operations in Sicily, Normandy, Holland, and Germany. His reputation was built on tactical innovation and willingness to take risks conventional commanders avoided. But the Siegfried Line breakthrough remained controversial within military circles precisely because it had worked through methods that violated established principles. The official Army history of the European campaign, published in 1947, devoted 3 pages to the 82nd Airborne's assault on the Siegfried Line. The account was factually accurate, but carefully framed. Exploiting conditions of reduced enemy readiness and utilizing intimate terrain knowledge gained through aggressive reconnaissance, the 82nd Airborne Division achieved rapid penetration of German defensive positions through night infiltration tactics. The history emphasized planning and preparation while downplaying the fundamental gamble, attacking fortifications in ways textbooks said would fail. What the official history didn't capture was the institutional resistance Gavin had faced before the operation and the grudging acknowledgement afterward that sometimes breaking rules produces better results than following them. Senior commanders who'd opposed the plan before September 14th claimed credit for authorizing flexible tactical approaches after September 15th. Officers who'd called the plan suicidal wrote efficiency reports praising the innovative operational methods they'd initially tried to stop. Gavin understood this institutional pattern. Success is claimed by the hierarchy, failure is attributed to the individual, and didn't fight it. He'd proven what he'd set out to prove, that military doctrine creates predictable patterns, that enemies prepare for predictability, and that violating doctrine can succeed precisely because it's unexpected. Whether the institution learned that lesson or simply documented an anomaly while reaffirming conventional wisdom was less important than the fact that 486 casualties had accomplished what conventional estimates said would cost thousands. The German perspective was more honest, perhaps because defeat allowed more candid assessment than victory. Von Roman, in his post-war memoirs published in 1952, devoted an entire chapter to the American breakthrough. He acknowledged that German defenses had been optimized for expected threats and vulnerable to unexpected approaches. He described Gavin's assault as militarily indefensible but tactically effective, a paradox that reveals the danger of preparing exclusively for rational opposition. Von Roman's analysis went further. Professional military education teaches officers to think professionally, which means predictably. The American commander who broke our line at Ubach thought unprofessionally. not through incompetence, but through deliberate rejection of predictable methods. We prepared for competent attacks. He attacked incompetently by professional standards and succeeded because our professional preparations could not counter his unprofessional methods. This suggests a fundamental weakness in military education. We train officers to defeat enemies who fight as we would fight, not enemies who refuse to accept our tactical premises. Auer, who'd commanded the 404th Regiment in the 2nd Defensive Belt, was less philosophical. His 1956 memoir was bitter about the barbaric American tactics that had made mockery of 6 years of defensive engineering. He maintained that the Siegfried Line would have held against proper military assault and that its failure reflected American willingness to accept casualties that civilized European armies would consider unacceptable. The subtext was clear. The Americans had won through recklessness rather than skill, quantity rather than quality, willingness to die rather than military competence. What Auer couldn't admit, what professional military culture couldn't easily acknowledge, was that civilized warfare meant predictable warfare, and predictable warfare gave defenders time to prepare effective counters. Gavin's tactics were barbaric only by standards that valued methodology over results, professional procedure over tactical effectiveness, adherence to doctrine over mission accomplishment. American tactical doctrine evolved slowly after the war. The Korean War saw some application of night infiltration tactics against fortified Chinese positions, with mixed results, successful when surprise was achieved, catastrophic when defenders were alert. The institutional lesson drawn was that such tactics required specific conditions: enemy complacency, favorable terrain, highly trained troops, and commanders willing to accept casualties. In other words, the tactics worked but shouldn't be relied upon. Gavin himself became Army Chief of Research and Development in the 1950s, advocating for helicopter assault as the next evolution of airborne operations, mobile vertical envelopment that could place forces behind enemy defenses without the limitations of parachute drops. He argued that military doctrine needed continuous evolution because enemies adapted to known methods. His advocacy was institutionally respected, but practically constrained by budget priorities and Cold War. Focus on nuclear warfare rather than conventional tactics. He retired in 1958 as a lieutenant general, frustrated by institutional resistance to tactical innovation, and convinced that the Army was preparing to fight the last war rather than the next one. His autobiography, published in 1978, devoted significant space to the Siegfried Line breakthrough and the broader question of when rules should be broken. The core argument: military doctrine exists to prevent stupidity, but taken too far, it prevents flexibility. The challenge for commanders is knowing when adherence to doctrine is wisdom and when it's cowardice disguised as professionalism. The 82nd Airborne Division preserved the story as part of its institutional culture. Veterans of the Siegfried Line assault passed down the account to new generations of paratroopers, emphasizing not the specific tactics, which were situation-dependent, but the underlying principle. When enemies prepare for predictable attacks, unpredictability becomes a weapon. This wasn't taught as formal doctrine, but as organizational ethos, the kind of knowledge that exists in culture rather than manuals. Modern military education uses the Siegfried Line breakthrough as a case study in tactical innovation, usually framed as achieving surprise through unconventional approaches, rather than violating doctrine to exploit enemy assumptions. The distinction matters to institutional thinking. One frames Gavin's tactics as creative application of principles, the other as rejection of principles. The first is teachable and replicable. The second is uncomfortable because it suggests that sometimes the principles themselves are the problem. The statistical impact was clear enough. The 82nd Airborne penetrated the Siegfried Line in 48 hours with 486 casualties. Conventional estimates had predicted 3 weeks and 2,000 to 3,000 casualties for similar results. Whether the difference represented superior tactics or acceptable recklessness depended on whether you valued speed and surprise over methodical certainty. Gavin had valued speed. The Germans had valued certainty. The result validated one approach and invalidated the other, but validation doesn't equal replication. The Siegfried Line breakthrough succeeded because it surprised defenders prepared for conventional attacks. Attempting the same tactics against defenders who knew such tactics were possible would face different results. This is the fundamental challenge of unconventional warfare. Once the unconventional becomes known, it becomes conventional, and enemies prepare for it. Gavin understood this. His tactics at the Siegfried Line weren't a universal solution. They were a situation-specific exploitation of enemy assumptions. The broader lesson wasn't always attack at night without artillery, but identify what enemies expect and consider doing what they've dismissed as impossible. That lesson is harder to teach because it requires thinking rather than following procedures, judgment rather than checklist execution, acceptance of risk rather than minimization of uncertainty. James Gavin died in 1990 at age 82. His obituaries emphasized his airborne innovations, his advocacy for helicopter assault, his service as ambassador to France, his writing on military affairs. The Siegfried Line breakthrough was mentioned but not featured, one tactical success among many in a distinguished career. Military historians remembered him as an innovator. Paratroopers remembered him as the commander who'd proven that audacity combined with planning could accomplish what caution couldn't. The German commanders who'd faced him remembered something else, that preparing for rational enemies left you vulnerable to opponents willing to be irrational in calculated ways, and that the difference between foolishness and genius often only became clear after the results were known. Thanks for watching the story of how General James Gavin's foolish night assault broke the Siegfried Line in 48 hours. If this resonated with you, hit that like button. It helps us reach people who appreciate stories about challenging conventional wisdom with calculated risk. What strikes me about Gavin's tactics is how often effectiveness requires violating rules that exist to prevent failure. The Siegfried Line was designed to stop competent attacks. Gavin won by attacking incompetently, by professional standards, and succeeded because German defenses couldn't adapt to tactics that made no doctrinal sense. Tell us in the comments, have you ever succeeded by deliberately doing what best practices said not to do? Let us know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more untold Withero stories about tactics that worked precisely because they shouldn't have. New videos weekly.